join together in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity we have to come together this morning to be in worship and fellowship, to consider the wisdom of your foolishness and the foolishness that we oftentimes find ourselves in. Guide us and direct us during this time. Lead us in your ways and help us to gain understanding. It's in Jesus' name we pray. It was the first winter that Beth and I were at our home outside of Bluffton while I was the minister of youth and Christian education at Grace Mennonite in Pandora. The house was located between Beaver Dam, which is just off of I-75 where there's a number of truck stops, and a little village called Rockport. The village only had 2 streets. You guess the names? Rock and Port. Kept it pretty simple. Nothing really there other than a few houses, United Methodist Church, a few trailers. But that winter, there was one Saturday night in which it started raining, it turned over to freezing rain, and then turned over into a whole lot of snow. And we went to bed, but around 2:45 in the morning, our doorbell rang. Now, we were living out in the country. Obviously, didn't expect anyone at 2:45 in the morning, but went downstairs to see who was there, and found that there was an older woman who was standing on our porch, very cold, and in distress, needing some assistance. She had been trying to go into work over in Beaver Dam at one of the truck stops, and her car had gotten stuck in a drift not too far from our house. So she needed a phone to be able to call and let work know that she wasn't going to be able to make it. Phone lines were down, so we loaned her our cell phone and she made the call. They came out and tried to get her car to move again, but the drifts were too bad, so she ended up not having to go into work. But now we had a little bit of a situation because here she was at our house. Turns out she lived over in Rockport, which wasn't far away. At most, it was about half a mile away. But it was cold. It was snowy. We didn't have a vehicle that was going to be able to get her through. We didn't know anyone to call, and so we had to decide what we were going to do. And as I look back upon it, I realize now that the decision we made was pretty foolish. But we'll come back to that in a moment. First, I want to consider these passages that we've been reading for this morning, for this week, because I think there's a lot of foolishness within those as well. We've been spending a lot of time in the book of Numbers. And in there we see all these examples of foolishness that took place. We have the story of when Israelites first came to the Promised Land. And they sent in this scouting party of 12 people, one leader from each of the tribes, to go into the Promised Land and to scout it out. And when they came back, 10 of those 12 says it would be foolishness to go in there. They're huge. They're fortified. There's no way that we have any chance of doing this. It was only Joshua and Caleb who believed in God's foolishness, that through God's power, they would be able to overcome these circumstances. But those 10 had sway over the majority of the people. Those 10 led the rest to believe that this would be foolishness, and so instead they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. 1 year for every day that they spent scouting out the Promised Land. In Numbers 17, we have the story in which the people were grumbling. Bill mentioned that before. The Israelites were grumbling to Moses, grumbling to God about these circumstances, these situations, this leadership that they had. And so God told Moses to take a staff from each of the leaders of the tribes and to place them, put their names on them, and place them next to the Ark of the Covenant inside the tent of meeting. And the next morning when Moses went in there, he found that Aaron's staff had sprouted, budded, and produced almonds. A staff. In Numbers 21, the people were again grumbling. They were complaining about their circumstances. And these venomous snakes came in and bit them, and people were dying. And so they cried out to the Lord for something to save them. And God told Moses to make a bronze snake, place it on a pole, rise it up, and anyone who's bitten by a snake and looked on that bronze snake would be healed. And they were. Now, doesn't that seem foolish to believe that a staff could sprout and bud and produce almonds, let alone overnight? Doesn't it seem foolish to believe that to look upon a bronze snake would provide healing for a snake bite? And yet these are the ways of God. These are the ways that God worked to bring about what the people needed, to take care of them in the midst of these circumstances. It seems like utter foolishness. But we haven't even gotten to Numbers 22 yet. This week we read about a talking donkey in Numbers. God gave Balaam permission to go to Balak. He had called him to come to curse the people of Israel. And he got permission to go, but along the way, God sent an angel who tried to kill Balaam 3 times. And each of those times, it was his donkey who spared him by turning off to the side. And each time, Balaam beat his donkey for seemingly being disobedient in doing this. And then God opened the mouth of the donkey to speak to Balaam. And he has this conversation as if this isn't odd at all. He's talking to a donkey. And then his eyes were opened and he saw why the donkey had done this. He saw this angel who was blocking his path, who had been sent to kill him. It seems like utter foolishness to believe that God would do these things. That God would take a ragtag group of ex-Egyptian slaves to a land and give them the ability to conquer it. It seems like foolishness to believe that a staff of dried out wood could overnight sprout and blossom and produce almonds. To believe that people could be healed of snake bites by looking upon a bronze snake. To believe these things seems like foolishness. And yet it's the way that God chose to act. What seems like foolishness to us, the wisdom of God. And I think that's a bit of what Paul is getting at in our passage for this morning in 1 Corinthians. He wrote to the Corinthian church. And he wrote to them about what seems to be foolishness to the people who are perishing. Christ crucified. It doesn't make any sense. How could that bring about salvation? How could death bring about a victory? And yet that is the truth of the gospel that we have. Because the world has a sin problem. It has for a long time. We've been reading about that all throughout our Old Testament readings. It began with Adam and Eve in the garden. We saw it with all the characters since then. Even Moses, a friend of God, who is also a murderer. There's a sin problem. And God has a solution. He sent Jesus to die on the cross, to be raised from the grave, and to bring about salvation. But the foolishness doesn't really end there, does it? As if it's not hard enough to believe that the resurrection would happen, that Jesus' death and resurrection would bring salvation. It goes on. It becomes a stumbling block to the Jews. It seems like foolishness to the Greeks. The Jews expected a Messiah who would be a conqueror, who would bring them freedom from their captivity, from their oppression. Not Jesus. Not someone who would die on a cross. The Greeks expected wisdom, things that made sense, that could be easily understood and put together. But instead, there's this foolishness of victory through death. The Romans had brought about the Pax Romana, the peace of their environment, through violence, not through sacrifice. How could this possibly make any sense? But even that is just the beginning. Because Christ's death and his resurrection bring about that unbelievable, foolish salvation that we don't expect. But that's just the beginning. Because once we receive that, we are also called to live into the life that Christ has called us to. The example that he has given to us. And we see throughout the Gospels that it didn't make sense to the people of the time. Jesus said things like, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He said to forgive not 7 times, but 77 times. He said to turn the other cheek, to not hold back from an evildoer. He said the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And it didn't make any sense. Those things seem like foolishness to our human ears. We can't imagine how that could bring about God's kingdom realities in our midst. And yet that's what the gospel message is. And even today, it still brings about responses of foolishness and disbelief that this could be what we're called to, that this could be the gospel message. That became real recently to Dr. Randy Beckham. Randy is the Vice President of Community Formation and the University Chaplain at Mid-America Nazarene University. And on February 10th, he delivered a message in chapel that highlighted 2 current movies. The movies were Selma and American Sniper. Now, I haven't seen the movies, but Selma is about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement that took place, a nonviolent approach to bringing about civil change. And American Sniper is about the most successful Navy SEAL sniper in American history. 2 very different situations. In his message he said, "I'm talking to those who would be followers of Jesus. This is not for those who don't care about being a Christ follower." He said, "I am extremely troubled. I have been for a long time and I've hesitated to address this subject publicly, but I cannot keep silent about it any longer. Something happened recently and has really disturbed me. As you know, 2 movies came out recently. Selma, the story of one of the 20th century's most influential Christian leaders, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who led a nonviolent movement that changed the course of American history forever. And American Sniper, the story of the most deadly Navy SEAL sniper in American history. Selma has made $29 to $30 million so far. American Sniper has made over $103 million in the first 4 days. Gives you an idea about who our heroes are, he says. I don't think it's an understatement to say that our culture is addicted to violence, guns, war, revenge, and retaliation. Unfortunately, so are a lot of Christians. This former administrator of the year then went on to critique placing loyalty on one's country above spiritual beliefs. Dr. Beckham said, "We have to be very careful about equating patriotism with Christianity. We never say God and anything. God is above all. Everything else is underneath. I love my country," he says, "and I'm thankful for freedom. But the earliest Christian creed was very politically incorrect and dangerous. Jesus is Lord, and Caesar is not. We have to put our way of life, freedom, on the top rung. And if you mess with that," he says, the typical response is, "I'll blow your head off." For a Christian, what is the top rung? Love for all. Because of these comments and suggesting that our use of violence was not consistent with Jesus' gospel message, Dr. Beckham was relieved of his vice president position. And what's interesting to me is in listening to his message and listening to him share this, he was very clear that this is something that he himself wrestles with. He's not giving the final word on this. He's not saying that this is the way it is necessarily. He's asking for conversations to help him as he wrestles through these questions of these difficult sayings of what Jesus has to say. Yet the response of the university was a clear indicator that still today, even among those who profess Christ, God's wisdom appears to be foolishness. It demonstrates that God's ways of turning our world upside down and inside out are still opposed and refuted. Well, that night 12 years ago, it was 3:30 in the morning. We were at our home. We had this woman who was there who wasn't able to get to her house, but really wanted to be able to get there. We didn't have a vehicle to take her there. There was no one we could call to take her there. And so I made a somewhat foolish choice, being in my mid-20s, that well, I'll just walk you home to make sure you get there okay. So I bundled up, and we headed out into the cold that night. It couldn't have been more than in the summertime, and thought it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Well, as we got about halfway there, I started to realize how big of a deal it really was. I didn't know that she had a bad hip. I didn't know that she had poor circulation in her legs and feet. And so as she was struggling to walk through these drifts, she was slowing down quite a bit. She was starting to lose feeling in her legs, and we still had another quarter mile or so to go through a lot of snow. So I came alongside her and took her hand and led her through. We did get to her trailer. She was able to get inside, cover up with a blanket, and warm up. But I realized how foolish it had been. What would have been wise would have been to say, you can just stay at our house, we'll get you back somehow in the morning. That wasn't the decision I made. Thankfully, God was watching out over us, kept both of us safe. After I warmed up a little bit, I was able to head back home and didn't have too much difficulty getting there. Oftentimes, it seems like we have a tendency to mistake wisdom and foolishness, to get them mixed up, to not know for sure which is which. I wonder how often is it the case for us as well? How often do we believe deeply in our own wisdom in the midst of a situation only to discover later how foolish we really are? How limited our imagination for what God can do really is. In fact, I wonder how often we choose our own wisdom over God's because we see God's wisdom as foolishness. I wonder how often God invites us into God's upside down and inside out wisdom, but we are unable to see the wisdom that is in it. May God open our eyes to God's foolishness, and may we live into God's upside down and inside out wisdom. Amen. WBTL, we believe in love.